So welcome everyone to our wrap-up talk for our Popularizing STEM conference. We have the pleasure to have with us here today Emily Cox-Palmer-White, who will be sharing her talk entitled Monstrous Mothers and Cyborg Pregnancies, Frankenstein Feminism and the Woman Without Organs, in which she will be discussing maternity imagery in science fiction, Frankenstein-inspired fiction, and the resulting misunderstanding of pregnancy influenced by patriarchal narratives. We will have our Q&A session at the end, in which our public can ask their questions either by using the raise hand button at the bottom of your screens if you want to appear on camera and ask your question, or you can also write us your question in the chat and I will read it out loud to our guests. So before I will give the floor to Emily, just a brief introduction. Emily has been specializing in gender theory, science fiction, and philosophy. Her research is concerned with developing new avenues in feminist philosophy using the work of Giorgio Agamben and Gilles Deleuze. She also writes on the relationship between gender theory, posthumanism, and female robots in science fiction and real-world technology. She has been awarded the SFRA Support a New Scholar Grant and is a winner of Foundation's essay competition. Her book, The Biopolitics of Gender in Science Fiction, Feminism and Female Machines, was recently published by Routledge. So I will leave the floor to you now, and thank you so much for being here.
Okay, thank you very much for introducing me. As I was trying to say before, thank you very much to the all the conference organizers for inviting me to speak. It's been a really enjoyable conference, and I hope I can do it justice by wrapping up with an interesting talk to finish us off. So I'm just going to share my screen now to get the PowerPoint beginning. Hopefully that's, oh, sorry, let's try that again. Okay, all right, so can everybody see that okay?
Yes.
Yeah, good, okay, here we go then. So yes, so here's the title of my talk, Monstrous Mothers and Cyborg Pregnancies, Frankenstein and the Woman Without Organs. So, the fraught Western relationship with pregnancy and birth has been reflected in science fiction narratives, arguably since the genre's inception, with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. This narrative, though written about a male protagonist creating life artificially, is full of the language and imagery of maternity. Dr. Frankenstein's tortured labours in the laboratory mirror the full range of typically maternal joys and fears during gestation and after birth. In Frankenstein, we see a combination of alternating ecstatic joy and deep despair as he brings the monster into being. He narrates, I had desired it, the monster's creation, with an ardour that far exceeded moderation. But now that I had finished, the beauty of the dream vanished, and breathless horror and disgust filled my heart. Just as Frankenstein's inconstant mood is reminiscent of an expectant mother, so too is the process which brings the creature to life. The doctor's description of the intricate work of making his creature is reminiscent of the painstaking process by which a child grows in the womb. He says, although I possessed the capacity of bestowing animation, yet to prepare a frame for the reception of it, with all its intricacies of fibers, muscles, and veins, still remained a work of inconceivable difficulty. The monstrous maternal imagery of this narrative has taken on a powerful afterlife, producing an extensive progeny of adaptations spread throughout various media and popular culture. We are continually revisiting the story of Frankenstein, it seems, and I think one of the main reasons we do this is because it frames pregnancy and birth, somewhat usually, as a creative and intellectual process, as well as an emotional, spiritual, and existential one. As Alan Bewell argues, Shelley uses, quote, sexual reproduction as a model for all modes of creation. She made obstetrics the master code of her aesthetics and applied its concrete arguments about the creative power of a mother's psyche upon the fetus and the proper environment for human reproduction. In the West, we tend to discuss pregnancy using the language of menial work, women labor, Birthing people are referred to as patients, while doctors and healthcare professionals are the experts, using their ingenuity to deliver the baby. This portrays medical professionals as the actors in the situation, while birthing people become passive participants, whose ownership of the birth process becomes, at the very least, contested. Millie Hill argues in her book, Give Birth Like a Feminist, that the birth room itself seems to be a crucible for a centuries-old power struggle in which a tug of war over who gets the ultimate credit for bringing life into the world is still being played out today. Western birth practices are often rife with medical interventions, vaginal exams, pain relief medications, episiotomies, forceps delivery, birth inductions, the use of synthetic hormones, caesarean operations, and so on. In fact, in the UK, only 20% of births occur without these. It is worth mentioning that while these interventions are sometimes necessary and even life-saving, in many cases they are also, even today, brought about in a coercive manner or even against the wishes without the consent of the birthing person. The situation is further complicated by the fact that many parents aren't aware, again, I'm talking about the situation in the UK only here that I'm aware of, that they may legally refuse any medical procedure during birth. Furthermore, the language of permission seeking and permission giving surrounding birth, where parents often ask if they may hold the baby or if they are allowed to give birth in the manner of their choosing, contributes to an imbalance of power in the birth room. So this is one way in which pregnancy and birth, as they're culturally constructed, exist in a contested zone. It seems we are always attempting to absorb these processes into the sphere of the normal through systems of medicalization and monitoring. Reproduction seems haunted by the spectre of the dangerous or aberrant, fundamentally in need of tempering through technology. Yet this attempt itself drives gestation further into the sphere of the quote-unquote unnatural. Through the character of Dr. Frankenstein, Shelley merges the maternal figure with that of the medical doctor. In horror and science fictional spaces, our anxieties around the origins of and rearing of children are often exposed. What emerges is our cultural sense that gestation and birth are in some ways perverse processes, visceral and messy. Their uncontrollable nature requires that they be tempered by rigid structures of monitoring and surveillance. In horror and science fictional spaces, the natural is revealed to be profoundly unnatural in terms of birth. This reflects the ways in which we medicalize and systematize the processes of the unborn. And Shelley Park summarizes this point nicely. Technologies, sonograms, amniocentesis, in vitro fertilization, and so forth, permeate the boundaries of women's bodies via photographic and biochemical means, undermining claims about the naturalness of reproductive bodies and identities. The story of Frankenstein is useful in challenging the ways in which pregnancy, maternity, and the unborn are constructed. For example, both the Doctor and his creation defy gendered associations and constructions. Dr. Frankenstein is often portrayed in various adaptations as the quintessential man of science, yet in the novel, he is disillusioned with the scientific community, who dismisses his research. He prefers to pursue the work of ancient mystics and alchemists instead. In developing his method for creating the monster, Frankenstein rejects the masculine institution of science for what we might describe as a more creative or even more feminine approach to the study of reproduction. At the same time, Frankenstein's creation is similarly host to a mixture of feminine and masculine signifiers. Quote, "The body of Frankenstein's creation literally collapses the distinction between technology and nature and production, metaphorically gesturing towards the collapse of discrete sexual identities as well." When Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, literature about pregnancy was non-existent. Yet even today, pregnancy narratives in popular culture almost skip over the actual gestation process, focusing instead on pregnancy as a dramatic device or a metaphor. As Parley-Ann Boswell writes, pregnancy, once introduced into a plot, can, quote, morph nimbly and become almost anything from a whispered word to an abstract idea to a visual image, to a consumable good. And this is, I think, often quite true in science fiction narratives. Fiction about pregnancy is often not about pregnancy at all, but rather haunts a piece of writing like a spectre of anxiety, often representing the unknown, the indescribable, or the alien. In addition to Frankenstein, two examples of pregnancy narratives I'll look at today are Ridley Scott's Alien and the Netflix film I Am Mother. These texts affirm Shelley Park's argument that, quote, mothering, like gender itself, is a technology, a social artifice produced by shifting power relations, not an essential identity tied to natural bodies. Rather, technologies, machines, are integrated into the practices of mothering in ways that transform the maternal body, making possible resistant forms of maternal agency. These texts do more than merely reflect cultural anxieties, the texts I'm going to talk about. I argue they also gesture towards new, more progressive ways of conceptualizing reproduction. So Deleuze and Guattari's concept of the body without organs is also helpful here in imagining the maternal body and that of the developing infant outside of established systems. Deleuze and Guattari describe this term as, quote, the reconstruction of the body as a body without organs, the anorganism of the body. It does not describe the literal remaking of the body as it might sound, but rather refers more to a rethinking or reordering of the ways in which bodies, concepts, institutions, etc. are constructed. The body without organs is, quote, opposed to the organizing principles that structure, define, and speak on behalf of the collective assemblage of organs, experiences, or states of being. This idea could help us to rethink how we understand the division or lack thereof between the pregnant body and that of the infant. If nothing more, it could perhaps make us realize the differentiation of the two is difficult, if not potentially impossible. I'd also like to introduce a term of my own, developed from this, the woman without organs, to describe this specific construction of the pregnant body. I use the term woman here in a loose sense, not in any way to exclude pregnant persons who don't identify as women, for example, but in a figurative sense to represent the cultural construction of womanhood and how this construction is frequently automatically understood as almost synonymous with motherhood, as opposed to parenthood. The body without organs, or as I'm developing it, the woman without organs, also applies to what Deleuze and Guattari actually do say, and they say that the two are related to, that the body without organs is related to gender. The question is not, or not only, that of the organism, history, and subject of enunciation that oppose masculine to feminine. The question is fundamentally that of the body they steal from us in order to fabricate opposable organisms. That is, the human body is never entirely one's own, but is a cultural product, inscribed with meanings which are largely out of our control. The cultural investment which adults have in gender manifests perhaps most obviously in the ways in which we rigorously gender children, and increasingly the unborn as well. Arguably, this is one way in which we manage our anxieties about the natural / quote-unquote unnatural nature of reproduction through our socialization and narrativization of children and unborn babies. Deborah Lupton argues that visualizing technologies as the photographic images of embryos and fetuses produced for magazines, together with obstetric ultrasound, have contributed to the contemporary imagery of unborn entities, their status as visible and knowable, amenable to monitoring. Gestation then becomes a kind of cyborg pregnancy, whereby the child's body becomes differentiated from that of the pregnant person in utero. The unborn infant becomes a product of technologically mediated socialization and surveillance, monitored and constructed through social media and app technologies long before they leave the womb. The woman without organs can be used here to conceptualize the ambiguous bodily connection between the pregnant person and the developing fetus. The ultrasound, often taking place at around 20 weeks, is a particularly defining moment, as this is when parents have the opportunity to know the sex of their baby. At this point, the fetus becomes capable of entering the sphere of the human, with a personality and a narrative, one which was previously impossible to construct until the baby's sex was known. So as Pelage argues, what really counts is to know the sex of the fetus, as it is this crucial information that enables the parents to see their baby-to-be as their baby. When the sex is clinically established, the story of the fetus can truly become a life story, more precisely, a gendered biography. This conclusion came from the author's study of many video uploads by parents narrativizing through the medium of YouTube the story of their baby's development, from the sexual distinction of male and female to the gendered categories of girl or boy through medical authentication. Furthermore, Deborah Lupton has argued that recent technological forms of medical surveillance, the use of social and self-tracking apps, have brought the unborn into the public domain and transformed the fetus into a fetishized cultural icon. Both she and Gareth Thomas have also researched the ludification and gamification of pregnancy through self-tracking smartphone apps, targeting expectant mothers mainly. These apps encourage pregnant people to engage in forms of self-surveillance and the surveillance of their babies. They encourage parents to participate in a performance of pregnancy and parenthood. Focused on physical appearance, these apps commodify the pregnant user and also frequently gender and commodify the unborn child as well, reproducing, quote, concepts of the unborn entity as a precious and beautiful already human. All this would seem to confirm Judith Butler's assertion that gendering is crucial. Bodies cannot be said to have a signifiable existence prior to the mark of gender. Judith goes on to say, gender norms, quote, establish what will and will not be intelligibly human. That is to say, we struggle to understand our children as properly persons until we are able to assign them a gender, and alongside this, construct a gendered personality for them, possibly in utero, long before they're able to display it for themselves. Returning to the novel Frankenstein, we can see how the making of the doctor's creature helps us to conceptualize the process of pregnancy and birth in a manner that challenges gender associations. The doctor assembles his new life form in a laboratory, sinew by sinew, combining the body parts of various other bodies. In a similar way, in the womb, a new life is made in and from the pregnant person's own body. Frankenstein's creature is created by combining many different parts to create the whole. When a pregnant person carries a child, they and the fetus similarly share cells, fluids, organs. In a way, Frankenstein's narrative allows us a window into the nature of birth untainted by traditional narratives surrounding pregnancy. From a feminist perspective, presenting maternity through the character of Dr. Frankenstein allows us to explore the idea of pregnancy and its wide spectrum of experiences without the potential risk of falling into the pitfalls of gender essentialism. If the novel were about a woman and her experiences of childbirth and child abandonment, the themes of the novel would be harder to explore without falling into regressive notions of maternity. Dr. Frankenstein's horrified reaction to the fruits of his artificial labor could easily be dismissed as the monstrous reaction of a heartless mother. Instead, Shelley presents Frankenstein as a nuanced figure, marked by associations of both masculinity and femininity. I have shown how Frankenstein's description of birthing the monster is characteristically maternal, in spite of his equally characteristically masculine, single-minded pursuit of making his creature. The many film versions of the novel often tellingly omit the process through which the monster is actually assembled. We do not see the pregnancy, seemingly a visually unrepresentable process, only the birth itself. Nevertheless, there is pregnancy imagery present in many adaptations. In the original 1931 film version, we see Boris Karloff strapped down to the medical table, evoking images of pregnant women similarly restrained in hospital beds. Later adaptations, including Kenneth Branagh's 1994 adaptation and the 2011 National Theatre production with Benedict Cumberbatch and Johnny Lee Miller, lean heavily on womb imagery, as we can see in the pictures there, to represent the moment the monster comes into being. Water also features heavily in most productions, mirroring the fluid of the amniotic sac. It is the disruptive nature of this birth process, whereby the doctor rejects the monster, that leads to the creation's trauma. His violent birth and early separation from his mother leads to disastrous consequences. Despite their separation, Frankenstein and his child are continually doubled throughout the narrative, linked by a mutual obsession with each other, a metaphorical umbilical cord which cannot be broken. Together they form a kind of woman without organs, together a single entity that never truly divides into distinct, separate forms. At the same time, Frankenstein's creature, like all children, is the product of childlike impulses, combined with parental influences and his experiences of the world. The creature evokes fear and anxiety because he represents the unknowable aspects of reproduction, composed of a multitude of composite parts, both human and animal. He is not quite human, and thus his gender is also indeterminate. His monstrous body defies categorization. In this way, he embodies parental fears about the unknowable aspects of children. Ultimately, the fear that the child will fail in some way to enter the constructed sphere of what we term human. Anne K. Mellor argues that the novel Frankenstein gave shape to Mary Shelley's own fears and anxieties about pregnancy, giving birth, and mothering. What if my child is born deformed, a freak, a moron, a hideous thing? Could I still love it, or would I be horrified and wish it were dead again? What will happen if I can't love my child? Am I capable of raising a healthy, normal child? Will my child die, as my first baby did? Could I wish my own child to die, to destroy itself? Could I kill it? Could it kill me? However, I believe the monster also represents more pedestrian fears. The fear that they will not conform to our ideal of childhood, whatever that might be. Children are, in many ways, unnerving because of their unique personalities and capacity to experiment with the world around them in ways which are potentially transgressive. Children challenge our assumptions on a regular basis. They push boundaries with their playfulness. Like many children, the monster poses uncomfortable existential questions for his creator, such as, why did you create me? These questions are reminiscent of the sort of uncomfortable things children frequently ask, like, where do babies come from? Children, like the creature, queer our understanding of the world. Frankenstein's monster mirrors these activities, reflecting the ways in which we see our own children's irreverence as monstrous and disturbing. I now want to move on to another science fiction pregnancy narrative, which, while not directly related to Frankenstein, does contain many similar themes and imagery which challenge traditional conceptualizations of birth and pregnancy. Ridley Scott's 1979 Alien film, along with the Alien Resurrection film, the fourth in the Alien franchise, are perhaps perfect films in terms of their exploration of the fetal unknown and the spectre of uncontrollable maternity, personified in the alien creature that is at once a fetus or developing child in the first Alien film and a mother in the fourth Alien Resurrection film. Taking both films together, we can see the doubling of mother and child in a similar way to Dr. Frankenstein and his monster. The first film, Alien, follows the crew of the Nostromo, a towing ship, on its way back to Earth that is redirected to an alien planet where an alien entity attaches itself to one of the crew members, Kane. It emerges that the alien has laid an egg in Kane's chest, which grows into a baby that, in the classic iconic dinner scene, bursts dramatically out of him. The human birth imagery here is inescapable, as is the resemblance of the face hugger with a placenta. Here, as in Frankenstein, a man gives birth. After killing most of the crew, Ellen Ripley is the only one to survive the alien. The woman without organs haunts the setting and premise of the film, challenging notions of bodily integrity, particularly that of the pregnant body. Boswell explains that, quote, "Mother is everywhere in Alien, beginning in the first sequence in which the computer on the Nostromo, named Mother, wakes the crew," end quote. As the crew members emerge from their sleep pods, it is as if we are watching as Mother oversees the hatching of her 7 eggs. One of these eggs, Cain, will in turn become Mother himself to the alien fetus. The second film, Aliens, pits one mother against another as the alien is pitted against Ripley, one fighting for the opportunity to reproduce, the other fighting for a child, which Ripley saves from a colony and adopts and protects throughout the rest of the film. The third film, Aliens 3, which you can see pictured on the right there, comes full circle. Ripley herself finally becomes the victim of an alien pregnancy, and at the film's end, she ends her life, rather than allow her body to become an alien incubator. Interesting, she dies at the moment she gives birth. Ripley becomes the monstrous alien mother she spent the previous films fighting, reflecting anxieties around unwanted or unplanned pregnancies, as well as reproductive violence. The fourth film, perhaps for me at least, is the most interesting. However, because it's much more head-on in its depiction and exploration of birth and maternal instinct, portrayed as neither heroic nor villainous. In Alien Resurrection, Ripley is brought back to life, cloned using her own DNA, as well as alien DNA. Meanwhile, an alien is also grown using Ripley's human DNA, which gives the alien the ability to reproduce with a human-like womb. No longer exactly on opposite sides of the human-other or human-alien divide, Ripley and the alien share a strange intimacy, which places them on a level playing field. They are both victims of patriarchal reproductive violence, their bodies violated and remade in the image of a specific new construction of pregnancy. While real-life pregnant persons and their unborn children are constructed through social media and self-monitoring apps, medicalization, monitoring techniques, these cyborg women have been literally constructed through technology. So Polly-Ann Boswell argues, quote, "Not only can a female Ripley be raped and humiliated by pregnancy, but she reproduces in ways that cannot be controlled. Clone Ellen Ripley represents just the beginning of another science fiction nightmare that has to do with pregnancy and reproduction." These films are haunted by a notion of pregnancy as ultimately an alien process in need of patriarchal control. However, in each film, every attempt to control pregnancy and birth is in some way thwarted, challenging the supremacy of masculine medical oversight in reproduction. The film Alien and Alien Resurrection present pregnant, maternal, and infant bodies reflecting each other without end. In these films, the pregnant body is legion. Anyone can be pregnant, male or female. On the Nostromo, the pregnant body extends beyond a singular entity. The ship itself becomes a vessel for gestation. Once the alien fetus develops within the body of Cain, it continues to develop within the bowels of the ship itself. The design of the ship and the design of the alien reflect one another as the alien's black rubbery body, composed of wire-like appendages and glossy limbs, mirrors the tubes, cables, and bulkheads of the Nostromo, and the smaller shuttle ship, capable of detaching, aptly named the Umbulus. Adding to this imagery, the central ship's computer, called Mother, has been programmed to seek out the alien, to nurture the infant, to transport it back to Earth. It is as if Cain were merely an organ within the mothership, aiding the gestation process, while the ship's crew become nutrients for consumption. So we can see the ship in the first Alien film as almost like, again, a woman without organs, kind of disembodied, pregnant body that, that completes the pregnancy process. So moving on to Netflix's 2019 film, I Am Mother, we see an inversion of the Frankenstein narrative in terms of gender. Rather than a human male using machinery to create a kind of cyborg being, in I Am Mother, a female robot, called Mother once again, creates a human child. The film opens with an extinction event which triggers the mother robot to awaken and carry out her function, to bring new humans, stored embryos, to life in her underground vault, protecting them from the world outside. But first, the robot themselves is brought to life by a series of machine arms. So here there is no reliance on the symbolic or mythical maternal figure to construct the identity of the robot mother. Instead, we are reminded that mothers come from somewhere, were once created, were once fetuses themselves, or in the case of mother, were once machine parts. The child's creation, the human child, is visceral. Unusually, there is no skipping over the physicality or pregnancy here. We see clearly the bloody amniotic sac and the gestating fetus inside the artificial womb, pictured in the lower picture there. We see the amniotic sac, gestating fetus inside the artificial womb. We also see the robot breaking the amniotic sac in a later scene in order to give birth to the baby girl. In Frankenstein, Shelley argues for the importance of a caring, domestic, maternal space for the development of children. The story is in some ways a cautionary tale of what happens when children are neglected and not provided with such space. However, in I Am Mother, we see an inversion of the Frankenstein narrative once again. If the creator Victor Frankenstein can be mapped onto the figure of the robot mother, and the monster onto the figure of the daughter, then in this version of the tale, the creator does not abandon their creation, but rather traps it within a claustrophobic domestic space of the underground vault, shutting out the outside world. In this narrative, we see pregnancy, birth, and child-rearing shown to be what we might describe as naturally unnatural. The robotic mother is a caring, loving parent, providing for all the child's needs, the exact opposite of Dr. Frankenstein. Yet this depiction is unsettling and horrifying. Mother approaches parenting in an ultimately mechanical way, reflecting the rigid structures currently already imposed on infants in the real world through technologically mediated means. The daughter character is rigorously tested and made to follow a strict routine. Brought up by numbers, she is presumably only allowed to survive because she was the human that happened to fit Mother's ideal of what a human should be, an ideal placed within her by human programmers. This is because we learn that this is the first daughter that the mother robot has allowed to survive. She's actually destroyed all the other children that she attempted to bring up before. So we discover these incinerated remains of many other daughters which the robot had birthed. Just as Dr. Frankenstein sought to destroy his creation for being imperfect, the mother robot sees imperfection in humanity and destroys her work in order to begin again until she creates her ideal child, the daughter character we see in the film. It is possible to read this as an indictment of the ways in which humans similarly place rigid expectations on children and the often violent consequences which children frequently suffer for failing to measure up to these parental ideals, for failing to conform to normative structures, for example. One can read Mother as a classic tale of the evil robot out to destroy all mankind. Such narratives, of course, are not monstrous in and of themselves. They are monstrous because of the mistakes made by their human creators. Dr. Frankenstein is, or should be, far more frightening than the monster. So to conclude, I'd like to talk briefly about how we might start to think about child rearing in a more potentially constructive way that doesn't give way to regressive ideas of pregnancy and gender normativity. Our first question should perhaps be to ask, well, what does feminism have to say on this issue? Well, There is something of a silence surrounding this topic of pregnancy, at least in Anglo-American feminism. Unlike French feminists Cizou, Kristeva, Irigaray, who sought to glorify pregnancy as a source of innately female power, such discussion seems to be viewed as dangerous from the Anglo-American perspective, a slippery slope leading to essentialism, reducing women to their biological capacities and thus reinforcing patriarchal notions of sexual difference, which place women firmly in the sphere of the biological and the emotional. Sarah Ruddick argues, quote, "It is difficult for anyone, certainly any feminist, to think publicly about mothering. Most of us have ambivalent feelings about mothers, including our own, and about being or not being mothers in a society which either insults maternal work or sentimentalizes it beyond recognition, while at the same time perniciously identifying womanhood with motherhood." So celebrating the power of pregnancy and birth would seem to be irrevocably bound up with accepting women's innately caregiving nature. While women's bodies seem ideally designed for the physical aspects of nurturing a baby, it seems intuitive to map the female body onto the female mind, if such a thing can be said to exist, and view it as similarly designed for the provision of emotional support. So Ruddick continues, "The ideology of motherhood, which turns upon self-sacrifice and sexual division of responsibility, power, and pleasure, is an implicit instrument for the subordination of women's lives to men's desires. To honour mothers or mothering comes all too close to praising the conditions of oppression." So there's clearly something very slippery about stepping into the territory of pregnancy, a topic so fraught with misappropriation, silence, and trauma. But celebrating reproduction surely does not have to be tantamount to devaluing women and/or pregnant birthing people. In fact, the devaluation of women and the fear and misogyny surrounding pregnancy and birth flow into each other. Women are constructed as inferior because of the ways their pregnant, reproducing bodies are similarly constructed as unusual and strange. At the same time, we devalue the process of pregnancy and childbearing, and child rearing, and this contributes to a sexist conceptualization of pregnant bodies. The difficulty we have in celebrating pregnancy and birth stems, at least in part, from buying into patriarchal constructions of birth as other, as well as a general devaluation of the domestic, private sphere. Another aspect of the problem with the way we theorize reproduction is the fact that we ourselves conceptualize it from an adult and gendered perspective. And an adult approach is generally to impose systems on that which we do not fully understand, in order to make it more intelligible. But this restricts and constrains the potential inherent in reproduction and the potential inherent in children. Children's behavior has the capacity to make us question our assumptions and to teach us how to think and imagine the world in different ways. We need to somehow move more towards this, towards a child-centered approach, perhaps, to thinking about reproduction that avoids our essentializing discourses that gender and categorize the pregnant maternal body as well as the infant body. One way to achieve this might be to rethink what we really mean by quote-unquote maternal. We generally seem to mean the way of being which is caregiving, nurturing, emotionally, as well as physically supportive, whereas paternal relates more to providing structure and discipline. Both these aspects of parenting are, of course, necessary, but to imagine that one gender should provide only one of these forms of parenting, while another gender provides only the other, seems restrictive and also seems rather implausible to achieve. Of course, here I am speaking about heterosexual couples, and there are many other family structures which can, I'm certain, offer valuable alternatives to this. However, to achieve a more child-centered approach that provides children with the space to grow and explore and challenge us, I argue, requires a more, again, quote-unquote, maternal attitude that provides the necessary empathy and support to allow this to happen. So going back to Sarah Ruddick again, her opinion is that, for example, men who are able to allow themselves to be mothers enter the truly human work of maternal work and learn its lessons. I look forward to the day when mothers are as apt to be male as female. We should expand on this idea, however, to include not just cis men and cis women, as is potentially implied by Ruddock's words, but anyone of whatever gender identity who exhibits maternal behaviors. So I'd like to leave you now with a quotation from one of my favorite sci-fi novels, Robert Heinlein's Have Spacesuit, Will Travel. In this novel, the protagonist meets an alien who, to him at least, exudes a kind of innate maternal, empathetic, caregiving personality that is extremely powerful. So he calls her the mother thing. Later, when he visits the alien's home planet, he discovers that this is not a characteristic which all the species share. She doesn't come from a race of mother things. Rather, he explains, and I find this quite remarkable observation, given that the novel was written in 1958. He says, I don't know when I became aware that the mother thing was not, or was not quite, a female, but it didn't matter. Being a mother is an attitude, not a biological relation. A mother thing is one who takes care of others. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Emily, for such a thought-provoking talk. So I'm gonna open the floor to questions in case anyone from our public has any questions. As you know, you can raise your hand or write your question in the chat. So while the public warms up and thinks about any questions they might have, I'm gonna open. I have several questions, but I think I'll just make one for now.
Okay.
I was thinking about the examples that you have and how science fiction especially portrays these pregnancies, and I think in these two very separate ways, right? In the more, as I think you mentioned, more male way of centering on technology, and the pregnancies look kind of clean, like they do in the image that you showed from Mother, even though it had the womb and the blood, there were some kind of things looking like veins, I will say, but it's still very clean. And in terms of audiovisual language, it's always very bright. And also in the scene of in Alien, in the fourth one, where the clones of Ripley are in these tubes, it's also very with white light and clean tubes and all this, you know, medical equipment and so on and so forth. And then when you compare this with other representations of maternity, which are also present in Alien, that are much more bodily horror, kind of Cronenberg leaning type of maternity and representation of pregnancy and this stuff. And I think in science, in sci-fi horror specifically, this image of maternity is present also in other fictions. And I was thinking specifically of fictions that have monsters coming out of screens, which is something that I work on. So I was thinking of The Ring. When Samara comes off the television, it comes with water, and that has been analyzed. I don't remember the author, but I know there's a famous paper that analyzes this in relation to pregnancy and birth imagery. So I was thinking, how do you relate these two in terms of uncanniness or abjection? Do they separate, and the unnatural that you were mentioning in the beginning, the comparison with the clash between the natural and the unnatural? So is the natural sort of in the middle, you think, and then it branches to this kind of technological abjection, and then to the other monstrous abjection, or do they, how do they move in relation to this, you think?
Right. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think it's as you say, you could say it's somewhere in the middle, the reality of what pregnancy is. I think though we're so we're so kind of again, this is talking about Western conceptualizations here, but we're so confused about what pregnancy and birth is really like, how we should really think about it in an ethical way or in a more real way. because, as you say, we have these extremes which are reflected, these extreme ways of thinking about it, right, which are reflected in science fiction and horror. So on the one hand, you know, the really visceral, messy, monstrous, crazy, you know, the fetus is coming to get us kind of narrative, you know, kind of narrative, versus the clean, medicalized, oh, there's no blood here, what blood, you know, kind of way of conceptualizing it as well. And I think, yeah, you know, this is obviously in our horror and sci-fi, but it's also in our day-to-day way of dealing with pregnancy. You know, from my own, you know, kind of experiences in UK and kind of American ways of talking about pregnancy, it's very much, you know, thinking about, you know, what about pregnancy in a kind of very sanitized way, particularly on social media and everything. There is the, you know, we don't talk about the gross aspects of what's happening to our bodies. We don't, you know, we're not, you know, totally honest about that. But when we are, it's very you know, it's kind of over the top in a way, like it's almost like it can become competitive, you know, kind of like who's got the worst pregnancy pains and everything like that. And then, you know, labor always becomes this thing that isn't talked about almost until it happens, and then everyone's horrified. So it's, again, it's this, yeah, it is these two extremes which headbutt each other in our fiction. And yeah, where is the reality? I don't know. I think we're going to have to do a lot of work to work out where it is really. But yeah, probably somewhere in the middle, because we don't want to disregard the fact that, yes, there is a traumatic aspect to it, even when pregnancy is described by women as positive and empowering. There is that aspect to it. There is a strangeness to it. And there's also the wonderful, sentimental and emotional and fantastic aspect of it. And we need to start trying to put those two together, I think. I hope that answers your question.
Sure. And I think it's also interesting how those two extremes seem to come from something that you also mentioned, that this male fear of the female body. Like both, like the bodily horror comes from, oh my God, this is scary and bloody, and the other sanitizing aspect also comes from that same objection, I think I will call it.
Yeah, I agree.
We have a question in the chat from Aisha Lali. Is Frankenstein creating the monster a form of womb envy?
Well, yes, it's certainly been interpreted that way by many. I mean, you know, obviously Frankenstein's been pored over and interpreted in lots of different ways over, you know, over the years. And yes, one classic, you know, interpretation is actually to say, oh, you know, Frankenstein is usurping women, you know, jealous of women's power and wants to take it for himself. Personally, I'm not hugely convinced by that, because I do think that Frankenstein, as well as the monster, they do act as, you know, when you look at Mary Shelley's own life and what she went through, you know, if we don't know, you know, she had several pregnancies. She was pregnant nearly all the time while she was writing Frankenstein, either pregnant or had a baby, or was mourning the loss of a baby, or was breastfeeding. You know, all of these things were happening at once to her. So I think it is reasonable from that perspective to say that, you know, she is mapping some of her own experiences, at least, onto both these characters, and they reflect some of the things she's, you know, concepts she's thinking about. So I think she's probably, potentially to an extent, she's talking about obviously the sexism she experienced as a woman at the time, living at the time. But I think, yeah, she's also thinking through, in some ways, you know, what it's like to be a mother, you know, and what kinds of fears and joys one experiences as a mother, and the fear of, you know, being an unsuccessful mother and all those other things which manifest themselves in Frankenstein. But yeah, there's lots of ways you can interpret it, definitely.
So we have another question in the chat from Ana Marta Marini. She says, could you say a little more on pregnancy surveillance related apps? How do they work? Do they lead to specific behaviors? Do they connect to other gender oriented apps for scrutiny?
Right. Okay. Yes. So I didn't have lots of time to go into detail about this, but yeah, I'll explain a bit. So the kinds of apps I'm talking about are things like, well, your classic self-tracking app, like think of MyFitnessPal, but or a kind of equivalent, where you record your steps and all that, but think of it relating to pregnancy as well, right? So you put things in like, you can put things in like, tracking your own body, but at the same time tracking the development of tracking the development of your baby as well, which of course they can only kind of guess at, and it depends what kind of information you put into it. But what happens essentially is it's almost like you're getting ready to, you're making your fetus ready to join this kind of social media and app world before they're even born, because you're starting to track them early on, if that makes sense. So it's surveillance in that way, in the sense that it's kind of another form of self-surveillance that you're putting on your baby as well, if that makes sense. And do they lead to specific behaviors? Well, I think they lead to specific behaviors in parents maybe, and that could influence the way, parenting. I think it adds to the anxiety around parenting. There's already so much pressure on parents to decide all the ways they're gonna bring up their child, right? And this kind of adds to this kind of pressure and these expectations, like, oh, not only do we have to worry about, different styles of, say, sleep training or routines or things like that, it's also things like, oh, how big are you measuring, like how big is your baby bump, are you exercising enough for your baby, are you eating the right foods, and everything become all of those kinds of pressures that are typically placed on women, pregnant people, suddenly are magnified through the use of these apps. And they can become these like games as well. There are lots of other games about pregnancy which are marketed even towards children, well, little girls who like have to have a pregnant avatar, and they have to like dress them up and take them to the beauty parlor to make them feel better because they're pregnant and not feeling very well. It's a very bizarre part of the App Store. Do they connect to other gender-oriented apps for scrutiny? Like what? I would ask, what kind of apps are you thinking about, Anna?
I don't know, maybe like, this kind of apps you were talking about, that you have to track something, or they are related to beauty,
right,
appearance, and that kind of stuff.
Okay, so maybe the example I just gave, maybe that goes with what you're saying. The idea of the idea of a lot of these apps, regularly, that because of the pictures they use and the sort of the imagery they use in the way the app's designed, they do, they do tend to promote this idea of a cis, white, middle class, pregnant woman, right, who tends to be quite skinny, and all of these things. So it's not just kind of peddling a specific idea, a gendered idea of what a pregnant person looks like. It's also it also is tangled up with ideas about sexuality and race and class as well. So yeah, it's very bad. It's very normative, incredibly normative, these apps. And what happens as well is, these apps where you track sort of how your baby's developing week on week or something like that, they will also kind of narrativize and gender the unborn child as well. So if you put in if you know the sex of your baby and you put in boy or girl, then the sort of baby avatar might do different things in the app, for example, sort of wearing a little pink tutu, and kind of they're made to, quote unquote, say things in the in the app each week as well, like, hi mummy, I'm nearly there, I'm nearly looking forward to meeting you, and all that sort of thing. So it's all coming together to making this very very gendered narrative.
Yeah,
Anna,
that
Fantastic.
pregnancy games sound like a cringe evolution of Tamagotchi kind of times. I was gonna bring this up specifically of what you were saying about the gender thing. And I think this is very interesting because the fact that the thing you're caring for, so the apps that you mentioned who are pregnant women, also makes it more gender for the public that's supposed to play with this. Because I was thinking about Tamagotchis or even Furbies who were kind of genderless.
Yeah, yeah,
And these games, these toys were targeted to both boys and girls
yeah.
more indistinctively than this kind of apps where you have a pregnant woman or a baby with a gender. And I was thinking exactly what you mentioned toward the beginning of your talk about how when the baby is assigned a gender, it becomes it starts the narrative. So I was thinking if you could connect these two things. So how the gender of the baby makes their perception of the person who's using the app also more gendered in a way. I don't know if you have any thoughts on this. Maybe it's just thoughts that came to my mind while you were speaking.
Yeah. So yeah, so are you asking sort of the difference between, not, well, okay, I think the answer to your question is basically if we don't have, or at least we've got ourselves to the point where since we've had the technology to find out the gender of a baby before they're born, we start to gender them to the point where we find it very hard to imagine our babies at all as who they might become without that gendering process. And I think that's probably, I'm sure that went on before, the evolution of ultrasounds. But at the same time, I think it's exacerbated it massively. So, I mean, this is going to be pretty purely anecdotal and kind of from my own experience, but I'm pregnant at the moment myself. And I know that, the thing which everyone asks is, of course, do you know the gender of your baby? And I happen to not know. But I've met some people who really can't get their head around not knowing the gender. Like one person I was speaking to who said, well, what clothes are you going to buy? Or what, how will you decide, all sorts of things. And I, trying to explain that doesn't really, I'm trying to raise my child gender neutral and doesn't really matter to me, and just couldn't understand that. And I think, again, this is all anecdotal that I'm talking about here, but I think that experience of mine is in some ways, it shows up again. It shows up in social media. It shows up in the way the article I was talking about in my talk about how people, they, in those YouTube videos that parents make about finding out the gender of their baby, it's only once they have the sex that they're able to start building on that and starting to imagine a fully kind of formed person in the womb. And if they're not able to find out the sex, as sometimes happens in ultrasounds, then it's kind of like, oh, that's disappointing. They feel like they can't engage in that process. So I suppose it becomes to two questions. Should we be really engaging in this gendering process at all? And also, why are we narrativizing our children so heavily at all? Whether it's in terms of gender or anything else, before they've really had a chance to articulate who they are, if that makes sense. And I think it does show something, Tamagotchis and Furbies being genderless in a way that, I think that was I remember them from when I was a child. So I'm sure that's sort of 90s era. Maybe just as, maybe ultrasounds weren't as, I don't know, as commonly used to find out the gender, or it wasn't as easy to find out the gender then. Maybe I wouldn't be surprised if there's some kind of connection there between, the way we, forms of play essentially, and the kind of things we market to children in different ways, and the evolution of technology and so on in terms of fetuses. I mean, for example, if you look back to the 90s, I think it's true to say there were many toys that were not particularly gendered. There were, like, if you look at Lego, for example, Lego was very non-gendered back then. But obviously now we have whole play sets which are full of pink and so on, and marketed specifically at girls. So yeah, so it's it's weird, and it's changed a lot, and it seems to becoming more normative as time goes on and as technology progresses, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think that retrospectively it works as what you said, that what you were hoping for, a more, maternity leaning parenthood that's not defined by gender. And I think it's a good parallel with the toys, because not knowing the sex allows you for a more genderless kind of taking care of the, well, toy or baby. But that's very interesting. I think. I wanted to ask if there are any more questions from our public. If not, I think I'm going to ask you one last question, also related to the previous question that we have about the Frankenstein monster and womb envy. And I know this might be I know this is a controversial issue, so you don't have to get too personal if you want to.
No, go
you don't
for
feel
it.
like sharing your opinions. But I was also thinking about surrogacy, like for a whole chunk of your talk. And I think this kind of connects to this idea of womb envy and having. And also the visuals of the womb, especially in the National Theatre representation of Frankenstein, which I saw, like when the monster comes of this very skin-looking ball where it comes out from. It looks to me kind of I'm using this surrogacy kind of womb to have the child.
Yes.
And Frankenstein being a male, of course.
Right.
So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how this idea of surrogacy connects to everything that you've been talking about with the gender perspective, especially the feminist perspectives. And I think you were saying that there's not so much research or critical writing being done in relation to pregnancy these days, but I do think that there's well, an ongoing fight on the feminist arena about this whole situation that usually opposes neoliberal feminism with other types of feminism. So
sure. Okay. Yeah. So I should clarify. I suppose when I'm saying there's a bit of a silence about pregnancy in feminism, it's a particular way of thinking about pregnancy, right? So there's a lot of work, obviously, as you say, surrogacy, particularly like Sophie Lewis's full surrogacy now I'm thinking of as well. So that is being done, and of course it is historically, reproductive rights, of course, are central to feminism. But in terms of thinking about pregnancy, I should have said thinking about pregnancy in a positive way, I suppose, and thinking about how it can be empowering, rather than kind of the temptation to sort of just not to talk about it because it's hard to talk about. So in terms of surrogacy, I mean, I suppose it's the difficulty with it. I mean, it's not something that I've done a lot of research into so far, but it's the difficulty, right, is that there is this temptation to use surrogacy as a kind of, again, potentially a way of avoiding that difficulty around reproduction, right? So it's kind of potentially, I don't want to throw any shade or anything. It's something that I know obviously is perhaps the only option for some people to have children and so on. So it's not something we should completely criticize or anything, or talk about it as if it's a bad thing to do or a negative thing to do. But at the same time, it is fraught with problems. It is in terms of race and class, because it is outsourcing something which potentially kind of dusts the problem under the carpet in a way. So rather than thinking, okay, how can we have a more ethical and empowering relationship with reproduction and pregnancy, why not outsource it to to other people? And that is problematic potentially. So yeah, so I don't know what the solution to that is. I suppose I think again we do need to, if we're going to talk ethically about surrogacy as well as giving, having children, without surrogacy, we need to learn to talk about both of these things openly and honestly, I suppose, and rather than thinking about them in a kind of either, and again, the overly medicalized way, or thinking about them in the overly gross and weird way, to put it one way. So yeah, I think it's something I need to do more thinking about, really, in order to fully answer your question. But I think, yeah, it's certainly, surrogacy is certainly something that pops up in, it's the imagery of that is in Frankenstein, and I think it would be really interesting to potentially read that novel as an exercise in which potentially exploring the ways that surrogacy can be used to exploit, and how, again, it is a product of science, of an institution which is still to some extent patriarchal. So, to what extent are we using patriarchal medical techniques to exploit often vulnerable women, from countries where they are exploited in order to have surrogacy take place. So yes, I hope that answers your question. It's something I need to think more about. So thank you very much for asking it, because I want to do more research now.
Thank you so much for all your answers and for your very interesting and thought-provoking talk. We've been very glad to have you here with us for a wrap-up talk to our conference. And thank you so much.
Great. No, thank you very much. It's been lovely. And thank you for all your questions. And yeah, best of luck with all your research, everybody.